Hey guys, welcome back to the Another Excuse podcast. I'm your host, Byron Greeley, and today's guest is Tom Ridges. Tom is the founder of Herdify, a company that helps brands identify the audiences being most influenced right now. Word of mouth plays such an important part in our buying decisions, and Herdify helps pinpoint where those conversations are happening and where brands can take advantage of them. This is a really interesting conversation. We discuss things like Herdify, how it all works, and why behavioral science plays such an important part in brand growth. We also discuss how Tom decided not to buy his dream car and invest in himself instead, and how that set him on the path of entrepreneurship. And we discuss how sales has played a role in Tom's career and how important it is. That's just a few bits of the topics we discussed in this conversation. It's a good one. I think you'll enjoy it. Enjoy the show. Hey, Tom. Thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited to get into it all. To kick us off, can you tell us a bit about Herdify and how it all works?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, likewise, Byron. Good to be here. Glad to have the conversation. Yeah, looking forward to having a deep dive today. So Herdify, what do we do? I guess the best way to think about Herdify is we're an audience data solution. Sounds a bit abstract, so I'll unpack that a little bit. But if we think about any business, they need to understand who their audience is. There's been plenty of data sets floating around for years. I think the most familiar for people is sort of demographic data. So age, what do they look like, where do they live? We've come at the world of audiences from a kind of lens of behavioral science. If you fundamentally understand how consumers make decisions, then you have a better kind of way of targeting them. You've probably seen all those memes that fly around with Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles, both men of the same age, same income. You can pick that apart, but broadly, the point being is demographics are not a great makeup for us, but more importantly, they don't actually sort of show how we make decisions. Kind of the short version of this is, humans are herd animals. That's why we call ourselves Herdify, which means most of our decisions, whether that's products we buy, how we vote, even our fitness habits, they're really kind of influenced by the people around us. So if you can identify where people are already talking about a brand or buying a brand, you basically have an audience that's much more susceptible to buy your product. So you're going to be more successful. So effectively, what brands do is they give us their first party data. We tell them where this herding effect's happening, and then they go and activate on it, right? That could be with advertising. That could be from a strategic point of view, where do we put new shops, or anything else that's hinged on location. But effectively, a SaaS provider that tells people where their best audience is.
Great. And how does that work exactly? Like, how do you figure out where these herds are?
Yeah. Well, I guess there's technically a number of ways you can do it. The first one is listen. Try and listen to every conversation. Probably a bit hard logistically, not to mention morally. Although I guess you always have the Amazon Echo issue there. Then the other way really is around modeling. So this is a model solution. So for those people who aren't sort of familiar with the data world, a model is basically where you take data and build something that predicts where that behavior is happening, as opposed to actually observing it, right? Because it's pretty much impossible to observe this, because the behaviors we're really looking at are, it's like the conversations happening on WhatsApp. It's people talking in their houses, people talking in the pub. Just logistically, you can't get into that. So the first thing you need to do is build a modeled solution. Like everybody at the moment, I almost don't like saying it, but we use a bit of AI in there just to process the pure volume. And then the key thing is you sort of need some concepts to work on, and that's where we sort of specialize. So the easiest parallel, without us spending an hour just on the model, because we could easily do that, is effectively think about virus modeling. So there's a specific discipline of science, it's called complexity theory, that allows you to model how a virus would spread. You're basically looking at two objects, two people, and saying, what's the probability that a virus will spread between them or has spread between them? And using that same maths and science, you can say, well, swap the virus, look for influence. It's kind of what we're looking for. And our model basically just has a predictive element there to say, there's a higher chance that this has been an influence led sale. And then we can do that at scale by running that through our own machine learning tools that say, right, how does that look like across the country? But really, virus modeling turned on its head is sort of our 30-second descriptor when we're sort of selling it to people.
That's so interesting. And like, what's the difference, or like, how impactful is your solution compared to, say, sorting by demographical data when running normal meta ads or something like that?
Yeah, we don't have a solid number, but we're generally looking at, we'd be disappointed if we're not seeing sort of 70% uplift. We've got crazy numbers, like we did it for a charity and the response rate was sort of 600-700% up. Um, the problem is when the numbers are too good, obviously people are skeptical because they think you're fudging the numbers. Um, but actually what's more important is about the long-term growth as well. So it's one thing about how do you acquire customers, but actually what businesses need to be thinking of. And I think this is more prevalent now. 5 years ago, it was just growth at any cost. And that was just like acquisition, acquisition, acquisition. I think businesses now have a lens of we need to be profitable. So if we think about these kind of networks that we're tapping into, is like how do we acquire them? Maybe we get that 70% bump, but actually these networks mean you're seeing things more often, which means you're being reminded, which means you're more likely to buy again, less likely to churn. So actually you buy more often and for longer. So the real sweet spot here is about long-term growth, long-term profitability, because then all of a sudden for a business, you're not just, acquiring customers, you're acquiring and keeping them. So as you acquire more customers, you get growth on top of growth on top of growth. And that's how you get exponential gains, right? A lot of businesses, unfortunately, are great at acquisition, but it's random. People churn away. So actually, even though they're acquiring, if they've got a leaky bucket, their growth doesn't sort of mirror their acquisition rate. And actually, what we're trying to do is strong acquisition, but stronger retention as well, just from acquiring the right people effectively.
That makes sense. And what kind of businesses do you guys work with at the moment?
Yeah, so I guess the first sort of qualifier we have, if you like, is I always sort of talk about innovators and disruptors. And that's more a mindset than a business type, because typically those business or those people have got some unique challenges. They're often running leaner teams and they're often running leaner budgets, and often that they're kind of fighting someone a lot bigger than them. So they've almost got the kind of the momentum's against them. So those people need to move fast. They need every penny to count, and they kind of want to cut away from the bullshit, if you like. They just want things that will work. Now, for us, that works in the charity sector. Like there's so many people in the charity sector that work like that, that when we started, this was a real surprise to me, but actually there's so many people in the charity sector that know that they've got a hard job and they just instinctively think in that innovative and disruptive way. So charity is a big one for us. And then we sort of put then the lens of, I guess, products that you think people would talk about. Now, actually, we talk about or see most things, but actually in terms of how the brands see themselves is almost a qualifier for us. So subscription services, like that's a huge one, whether that's food, pet food, any of those types of things. Travel, when you spend however many thousands on a holiday, you generally talk about it. And, when you come back with a tan, people say, where have you been? So kind of that kind of comes there. And also quite a bit in automotive as well. Cars are like huge billboards, right? When they're driving and when they're parked up on your neighbor's streets, or when your friend buys a car. I bought a car recently and a friend walked up to me and went, as soon as you told me you bought this car, I can't stop seeing them everywhere, right?
Yeah.
That's something called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, in that our brains unfilter things that are familiar to us, but it's such a kind of powerful thing in automotive to sort of tap into. So yeah, that's kind of the broad area that we work in.
Great. And how did you come up with this idea?
Oh, okay. It's a long-winded story. I'll give you the abridged version if you like.
No need. If
Um,
I'm here for the long version, if do you
cool.
want?
Well, I guess it started with a different problem, to be honest with you. So it was before I had kids, so it would have been probably like 2011. I was in Paris with my wife, or sorry, then girlfriend. She went through the stages to fiance to wife, and I vividly remember getting off the metro at the catacombs, wanted to find a restaurant, pulled out my phone, whatever the apps were at the time to look for a restaurant, And I remember just having a screen cluttered with just restaurant recommendations, all 5 stars, all amazing. I'm like, how do I filter this, right? There's no way all of these restaurants can be really good. That took me down a sort of journey of, well, how do I solve that problem? And kind of my fundamental view was, we all have people that are like us and we all have people that are not like us, right? Now, someone might give McDonald's 5 stars, some might give it 1 star. I wouldn't judge in that equation or say anybody's wrong. That's just personal preference, okay? I'm not personally a fan of McDonald's, so I'd rather line up with someone who also else isn't a fan of McDonald's. And my theory was, if I can find 10 people who give my favorite restaurants the same rating as me, then their restaurant number 11, there's a much better chance that I would like it. Okay, so fairly similar. And same with dislikes. It's about matching people. So I built this app. It was called Illuminks, illuminating hidden links, which was basically about how do we connect people with similar tastes together to make recommendations. Now that didn't work out. Like we built the app, but just we can go into why it didn't work if you're interested later. But that sort of led me on the journey of these connections about people. Then, as it happens in life, I then met someone a few years later, a guy called Dr. Tim Dry. He was head of applied stats at Cambridge. He came at the world from studying these networks, right? And until then, I didn't know there was actually a scientific discipline behind it. I was just always fascinated in human similarity and those links. We then got kind of talking. We did some other bits together for a few years, and then this was one of the bits we were doing. And then once the pandemic came, sorry, not the pandemic, once as I saw the sort of cookie apocalypse coming, I thought, well, do you know what? There's a business there. And we sort of formalized that as an idea to productize this, because previously we were sort of doing it as a professional service, hugely expensive, hugely slow. So yeah, that was the sort of link in. So like I think a lot of things in life, I think they sort of come in these sort of serendipitous, like roundabout, random ways. But yeah, that's where we ended up.
Cool. I'm quite interested by the step you took from sort of the agency, like doing it manually, to productizing the service.
Yeah.
How did that take place?
Yeah, well, and this was a good lesson for me, because originally what we thought we would do is we were basically running a data consultancy, a data analytics consultancy, and we were using this side to do all sorts of crazy, wonderful, wacky things and try and build a product on the side. The problem is, from a kind of business model point of view, if you set yourselves up to be an agency, then those consultancies have a model where it's all about occupied, billable hours, if you like, in terms of making the model work. So it became really difficult to just get the cycles to allow the team to spend time building a product, right? There was always the tension of, well, we've got billable work to deliver. Let's deliver the billable work, and let's deliver the billable work. And my background's tech. I've sort of always come from that side of it. I was more interested in building product. So at that point, I could just see that there's always going to be a tension. And I've seen this before. You see consultancies trying to build product, and it just is really hard. And I thought this needs to be a separate business run like a product business. So there were a few of us running that business. There were 4 of us. So I decided to buy that IP out along with Tim, and therefore set this up as a business to not be focused on consultancy, but to be focused on how do we solve single-handedly the problem that we're focused on solving, which is how do we help brands tap into how consumers make decisions. So yeah.
Interesting. And what would you say is the key to building a successful business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I always answer that, and it sounds like a horribly try answer, but I think defining success, what success means for you. Because I think, it's particularly in the startup world, it can mean 100 different things. Like we see the kind of the posts about, hey, we've just raised this much money. So for some people, I think success is they want to raise Series A, Series B, Series C. Okay, and that's not a problem. Back to the restaurant categories. I have no problem with how people define success. But for me, success, we kind of really wanted to kind of keep as much of the business as we could, because for me, the VC business model, right? Let's back 100 companies. Let's push them as hard as we can. 98, 99 will blow up. One will go big. And I sort of didn't want to play those odds of we're the first to market with this product. it's complex. Okay, so it's not a kind of me too copying product. So I really didn't want to just get pushed too hard and blow up while we're trying to figure out how we sell this. So the first thing for me about defining success was, look, we'll take as little money as we can and let's try and own the business so we're in control. So that's the first piece, defining what success is. From there, I don't have a really succinct, like, this is what you need to do. And we're still on our journey of success, right? We're doing well, but we've still got the usual startup dilemmas. I think my biggest thing is just being curious, and I don't mean that in a really cheesy way, but if you're genuinely asking questions about everything, why are our customers buying? Why are they not? Why did the team do this? Why do they not? If you're always thinking about the why, if you're always asking questions, I think it just leaves you open to, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? Right? Because often you can get so bogged down into, this is the problem we're solving. We've spoken to some people that we validated as a product. You then just go headlong into solving the problem. And then by the time you take your head up to have a look around and go, cool, we've solved, like, the landscape shifted. If you're asking questions the whole time, it just allows you to, you're never going to react fully, but like, it allows you to try at least get ahead of some of those bits, or just question your own thinking. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah. And um, to be proactive about that approach, do you actively ask like current clients questions? Do you ask people studying data within the industry? Like, what's your approach there?
Yeah, and it's one of these things I constantly need to get better at. It's like one of my monthly reminders. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm perfect at it. But yeah, I'm sort of going through the transition, if you like, because when we were new and we didn't have lots of customers, it was more about trying to kind of just speak to people in the industry about what they thought. They could be people who we thought were an ideal customer, people who we thought were maybe competitors. But now what I'm doing, and encouraging the team to do, like encouraging the product team, is to actually speak to customers, customers or people who have churned. Thankfully, churn isn't too big a problem, but there's always churn. And actually finding out, why they churned is good, because then we can avoid those sales situations in the past, in the future. But also, again, how do I speak to current customers, or, we've got loads of relationships with agencies that aren't moving fast enough. So I'm trying to set myself, trying to meet those agency leaders, once or twice a month for coffee, just to understand their business. It's not about me selling to them, but trying to understand them and where they are. So it's sort of evolved. And I think, I've sat around many tables in my career in product meetings where everyone tries to solve the problem internally. Like, why do we not think this working? And I've always, even before I did this, I was always thinking, well, shouldn't we ask the customer, right? And if you're lucky enough to have customers, then most of them are flattered to want to be part of product development. If you're respectful with your time and you come prepped, and if you're prepped, you don't need lots of time. And if you turn up with those sessions prepped with some punchy questions and help them get to coach them through where you're trying to get to, I think people generally enjoy being part of it as well.
Yeah. And do you find that sometimes having those conversations can lead you in completely different directions that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I do. Like, there's been some specific ones about messaging. Um, messaging, I think, can be one of the most complex thing in a startup, because especially as a technical founder, you'll start talking about how clever you are or how clever your product is. Like, I cringe now, but our first few months, we would talk heavily about network science and complexity theory, and people would be like, yeah, sounds really cool. But they had no idea what we did, right? Because we just were trying to lean too much on the tech rather than the problem we solved. But it's funny, just last month, I think it was, I spoke to one of our customers that we'd signed probably a year ago. So they sort of had a kind of an earlier iteration of our message. But it's just really interesting hearing the phrases that still resonated from them, some that we'd sort of phased out, and like hearing them play them back is just a really interesting way to say, okay, that's why you've hooked into that. And then, well, but why was that important? And then when they explain that, we're like, okay, that's actually the bit of the product they found interesting. So, going back to those people that you've sold to a year ago and just saying, what did you remember? Why did it stick? How do you still talk about us? It was, yeah, super, super fascinating. And they were the conversations, I mean, that trigger me to go, I've just got to have more of these conversations, more conversations with people we've already sold to.
Yeah. Yeah. I can
Yeah.
imagine that being really helpful.
Yeah, it
And
really is.
do you think anyone can build a business, or do you think you have to be a certain kind of person?
Um, I don't think anybody can. But I don't think it's the person that maybe we're all conditioned to think it is. Right now, I think I certainly held off starting a business, way too late. Well, not sorry, way too late is the wrong thing, but I think I started in my mid 30s, maybe late 30s. Because I'd always sort of believed that to be a founder, you had to be gregarious and, extroverted and, willing to put yourself out there. And I can do that from a corporate point of view. As we all have jobs, we learn how to put on different faces. But I'm an introvert. I'm sort of more comfortable thinking and internalizing and scribbling on whiteboards. And I just thought that's not who founders are. And I think that was so when I realized that's not it. That was quite enlightening. Um, I think actually the people who can do it is back to the point I made earlier. It's just those people who are curious. I think if you're naturally asking questions, that's kind of the skill. It doesn't matter whether you love talking in front of people, whether you'd rather not talk in front of people. If you love asking questions and thinking about how you can solve the problem, I think that's the only qualifications you really need. Is my view.
Yeah, I had a similar view before I started this podcast, because I thought there was a version of me that I had to work towards
Mhm.
in order to start my own thing. And after having conversations with so many different types of people, it made me realize that, like, oh, there's so many different types of founders, and the common thread is they believed in themselves and they just got shit done.
Yep.
And that's really all it comes down to. And no matter what, if you're introverted or extroverted, if you have those two traits, then that's all that really matters.
Yeah, I love your point. It's just getting shit done, right? Like
Yeah,
people who have a drive towards action, and I think people who don't necessarily sweat the detail. I think the difference they can sweat the detail when it matters, but they're not kind of hung up on it. Then just crack on. I always think, what's the worst that's going to happen? I always joke to people that as a founder, if someone came to me and said, "I'm looking for a job. I tried to start my own thing and it didn't work," I'd bite their hands off to hire them, right? And I think most employers are like that. Because anyone who's actually put themselves out there, tried to solve something, just demonstrates so many qualities that any employer wants. Someone who's by definition they're action orientated. They see a problem, they try and fix it. Someone who's willing to put themselves in uncomfortable situations, and then someone who's willing to deal with failure. I Any employee or any employer is going to see that and go, yeah, okay, right. When can you start? So for people starting businesses, I appreciate there's still finances to worry about and those bits, but you know, especially when you're earlier in your career and you maybe haven't racked up all of those things that people acquire in later life, car payments, mortgages, and kids, and all of these things. By backing yourself, I think if the worst happens, we have to acknowledge startups go pop. I think you're just making yourself infinitely more employable. I can't imagine any employer is going to look at somebody who's tried to start a business and go, yeah, no, we're not looking for ambitious people who are smart and try and solve problems. And if that is the person, you probably don't want to work for that business anyway, right? So I think you just make yourself more employable. So what's the worst that can happen? That's kind of what I say.
yeah. And a lot of people frame it that way in the sense that, like, what's the worst that can happen? We don't really go the full distance in with that thought experiment. A lot of people think like failure is this big scary thing, but I've heard a lot of founders say that, like, okay, the worst possible scenario is maybe I end up on my parents' sofa for a month or two while I look for another job. And in the grand scheme of things, like, if you're fortunate enough to have supportive parents or a network or social circle that is able to support you, then, like, taking the risk seems a lot more worth it to me than not trying at all.
Yeah. And it was a big part for me. I thought, whenever I'm getting near the end of my time on the planet, I thought I'd want to look back and not regret that I didn't try, because I'd always wanted to do it. And I thought probably better to give it a go and say I at least tried it rather than always wondering what if.
Yeah,
So it's kind of
exactly.
a big driver.
As the one podcast I listened to, My First Million, the host Sean Puri says quite often, ask yourself what would make the better story. And I like thinking of that whenever I'm making sort of big decisions because, yeah,
Yeah,
you
it's
are
a
going
nice
to
way.
look back and you don't want to regret the decisions you made, I suppose.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, agree.
And so, speaking of like starting and going out there and trying to start your own thing, what made you decide? So, you noticed this issue with how people rated restaurants and that it wasn't really reliable. What made you decide, okay, I'm actually going to solve this problem? Because I'm sure so many people back in 2011 were scrolling through apps trying to find restaurants and they did nothing about it.
Yeah, and I think what made me was it's also one of my lessons, to be honest with you. But I spoke to a lot of people about it, and everyone had the same problem. I was also at the time, again pre kids. I ate out a lot, so I was, you know, people used to ask me a lot for recommendations. So my friends, even in London, which you know we all knew, people were still struggling to find recommendations. Sorry, find restaurants they wanted to go to in London. It's not hard to find. You can Google. There were plenty of blogs at the time. Like, it wasn't hard to find the information, but finding information you trust was hard. So it was just based on that. There were people trying it, but at the time everything was based on 5-star. It was based on a traditional review system, and I just thought, well, look, I can't see anyone else doing it. Let's give it a go. And I just thought, why not? Effectively.
And
So
how did you take that leap? Was there like a safety net of some finances saved up or like?
yeah, yeah. So at the time I was working for Microsoft, and so good job, the tech sector, and I'd saved loads of cash. I was going to buy myself. I remember the car specifically, Mercedes AMG C63. So for those of you who are not into cars, it's just a really nice, fun, loud sports car. Totally pointless because you can still do 70 miles an hour on a motorway, but we'll ignore the kind of logical stuff there. And I've always brought up to the things you buy on credit are houses. Buy cars on credit, right? I sort of believe in that. So I saved up the cash to buy the C63. And I just remember looking at the money one day and thinking, oh, two options here. I buy the C63 and I'm stuck at Microsoft, for the next however many years while I can save up enough money to do something more sensible with my money. It's not a slight at Microsoft. Honestly, it was like somewhere I wanted to work for ages. Finally got there, loved it, amazing company. But there was still this itch, and I thought, well, or I can, I can't remember what I was driving at the time. I think I had a secondhand Golf. I was like, I can stick in my Golf and try and spend the money. So I used that money to kind of build the app. As I say, it didn't work out. So it was about 70K that I spent, that got wasted effectively. Not totally wasted. Like, I used the prototype quite a few times when I was traveling in Europe on various holidays, and it worked. So I found some great places, but never sort of made any kind of serious money out of it. And I sort of said, well, look, I could have spent that on an MBA, could have spent it on a car, but I learned some stuff about product, learned a lot about the UK investment market and business models. I think if you listen, I used to listen to a lot of podcasts like Masters of Scale, people who started in PayPal mafia type people, and a lot of those stories are about, well, take Instagram, right? The guys that started Instagram built a game that wasn't working, and one of the features of that game was a photo upload feature. So they raised £1 million to go and explore what that might look like, right? So I'm sitting there going, you can raise money to explore ideas. So I thought, well, I know I'm going to collect lots of data on human behavior here, right? That's unique in the market. I know that restaurants will find that data useful, based on, they know who's more likely to go there or what other restaurants people go to. Like there was a stream there, but because I didn't have the data, I didn't exactly know what product I could build from the data. And I sort of assumed that, in the US, you can go and say, well, I've got this data stream coming that I'll monetize. The UK, and certainly there, I think it might have relaxed a little bit. They're a bit more, I guess, less risk adverse. Sorry, no, more risk adverse. And they sort of really wanted to know, well, okay, what's the exact data? How are you going to monetize it? What's the charging scheme? And at that time I built the app, spent the money, and things didn't work. So, but that was a good lesson in terms of understanding how the UK investment market works. What you need to think about when you are structuring these things, as well as building a product. I'm a tech guy, but I've never run developer teams. My expertise was elsewhere. So just again, how do you communicate with developers in a way that allows you to, you think you said, I want this to be red, right? And it comes back and it's stripy green, right? That's a jovial example, but kind of lost in translation stuff. So yeah, good experience, but one I totally don't regret, and I wouldn't be on this stage of the journey if I hadn't done that. I'd probably have pictures of an old C63 up in my house somewhere of telling people of a car I once had that was really fast that I could no longer afford to run because of petrol prices.
And do you think that putting that kind of pressure on yourself pushed you, well, not necessarily to make it work, but pushed you to figure things out a lot faster and then, like, say, opposed to doing something on the side and just sort of having a side project?
Yeah, I think so. I started it on the side, and then I sort of decided to go all in, because I think, kind of almost to the question you're asking, the problem is when it was just on the side, you know, work was busy. There's always an excuse. There was never really a deadline, and I sort of realized that I couldn't. If I was going to try and back then I was trying to speak to lots of restaurants and understand their business model. Saying I could only do that on a Saturday morning, and their busy times, it didn't work. So yeah, I think it was a good thing to do. You kind of put the pressure on, allowed me to focus, and also the other thing is allowed me to fail quickly. Well, quickly, relatively, but I could have kept that going as a side project for 3, 4, 5 years with the dream, deluding myself that it was coming. But actually, you can ask yourself many more critical questions when the end of the runway is coming. Of do we really think there's something here, or have we just timed this wrong? Have we played our hand wrong? And played my hand wrong. But put too much on the table to start with, and went bust, right? And that's also part of the game. And I could have had the same outcome, but for 4 or 5 years later, and wasted more of my life with the same outcome. So yeah, it was a good thing to do.
Yeah. And at the end of it, did you end up starting another business, or did you go into a 9 to 5?
No, started another business. I did a little bit of consultancy, just to sort of build the cash flows up
Hmm.
a little bit. So, and I was, there was a few things I was exploring. So while I was in the exploring phase, I had a bit of time. So I sort of tried to do a couple of days consultancy to build up the cash. Again, thankfully, tech back then at least was quite easy to do consultancy for. But yeah, once I left Microsoft, the last people that paid me. Once I left Microsoft, I never went back full time. The odd consultancy stuff, but then after that, it was always my own thing, or my own thing with others, basically.
I think that's quite common. I don't see many people who sort of catch the bug of, like, independence and running your own thing, and you sort of calling the shots to going back to someone else calling the shots for you.
Yeah, I think I'm unemployable. I'll be honest with you. And the irony is one of the other catalysts for me doing it at that time is, we had part way through the kind of the build, like the kids came along, and I didn't want to be traveling. My old job, didn't spend loads, but I spent enough time in America, which, you know, you were there for a week. It takes a couple of weeks to recover and prep, right? So you're not present. And, I didn't want to work all hours, with the family coming. The irony is I work more now, but not in like that crazy, founders work a million hours a week, but just because I genuinely enjoy it. I see my kids loads, but if I'm not with them, I can, sneak away and do some bits, or, it just works really well. So yeah, unemployable. And I think I actually work more than I used to. And I thought I used to work quite a lot anyway, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
the
I think
journey, and it's
yeah, I
fun.
think that's the common sort of trait. Once you find something you're passionate about and really enjoy, it doesn't really feel like work as much. So from the outside looking in, people may say, "Wow, you were working crazy hours," but
Yeah.
because you enjoy it, it doesn't really feel that way. It doesn't, like, burn you out like, say, a hectic how a normal job would.
Yeah, I remember someone in my family, they were down, they were nipping out into town, they were staying with us, and they were like, "What are you gonna do while we're out?" I was like, "Oh, I'll get a couple of hours of work done." They were like, "Why?" I'm like, "Because I love my job." It's like, I've if there wasn't enough time to go and ride my bike or do something else, I'm like, I'll do my job, and that's something I say to my kids: if you can find a job that you love doing, then it's a much better place to be. Don't get me wrong, startups are still a job. It's hard work. There's disappointment, there's frustration and annoyances, but it's still a job that I really love. So if you can do that, then it's a great place to be.
Yeah, I agree. And have you run into any challenges in your entrepreneurial journey so far?
Yeah, I'd say sales has probably been my biggest challenge. Sort of as I mentioned, being a tech person, never had a sales target. I've been in sort of pre-sales in various parts of my career, so I've been around the sales conversation, but never really have never been a salespeople. And I guess salespeople get a lot of stick, right, for it just being the reputation that salespeople have, but actually, good salespeople are worth their weight in gold. Like gold, it's such a skill to be a good salesperson. It's easy to sell products that have got momentum behind them. If you're kind of the flavor of the month product, anybody could do that, right? It's effectively glorified order taking. But in the startup world, it's nothing like that. You've got two problems. Nobody knows who you are, right? So the first thing is, the irony is our whole product is about, if people don't know who you are, they're not going to buy your product, right? And that's what we run into. That's our kind of, especially in the early days. And especially when you've got a product that's new, then you also invite skepticism. So yeah, just try to do that. And I had a couple of partnerships as well that haven't worked from a sales point of view, which was difficult. Not in this business, but when we were doing the first app that I mentioned, the restaurant recommendation, I merged with another guy who was trying to solve the same problem. We were building something differently. He was from a commercial background. And I thought, great, that's sales sorted, right? But that didn't really work out. Fundamentally, we weren't selling. Um, so that's always difficult, right? When you have a co-founder relationship breaks down because you're both invested in the business, and you have to sort of try and work out how to exit that person. And then a few more other kind of bumpy sales experiences. So yeah, I think, that's now fixed, but yeah, that's certainly been a tough thing to deal with as a technical founder, I'd say. And it's one that I think all technical founders shouldn't underestimate, how hard that bit can be, whether it's doing it yourself or, more importantly, scaling it, right? Because there's only so much time you can do founder-led sales for. If you can't scale past founder-led sales, then the business doesn't have a history.
Yeah, true. I I'd say more recently figured out the importance of sales because of the negative perception of it growing up. I always pictured sort of, cold callers and
Mhm.
things like that, and just watching my parents sort of hang up the phone and being angry
Mhm.
about someone irritating them. And
Yeah.
so I always saw sales and salespeople as sort of sleazy in a way.
Yeah.
But I later on figured out that like you're selling all the time. You're even selling yourself. Like I work in personal branding. That's a
Yeah.
form of sales. So
100%.
like it's once I sort of accepted it, acknowledged it, and started learning about it, I realized that it is a hugely important skill.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd recommend anyone to go into like a cold calling job right out of uni or out of school just
I
to
agree.
learn how to sell and get rejected all the time because you get a hard skin and then
Yeah.
you're able to just roll with the punches and do a
Yeah.
better job.
Yeah. I agree. I think the best lesson I had on sales was the mindset of sales, because like you just have that view of they're sleazy, guys or girls pushing stuff. And someone sort of gave the analogy of a doctor to me, and like, when you go to a doctor, you don't walk in and he starts pushing his latest asthma medicine on you, right? Like, he's sitting there asking questions to understand what your problem is, to understand if he can solve it and whether he's got the tools to solve it. So he's like, okay, well, what's wrong? Okay, well, are you struggling to breathe? Okay, you're lightheaded. Okay, well, this could be the problem. Now, there's a kind of self-worth there that doctors have because they've gone through the training and we've gone to them with a problem. But it's no different in business, right? We're phoning these people because they're likely to have a problem that we can fix. So we're not there doing them a favor. They're not doing us a favor. Business is about selling to each other. If we think we can help them, it's a peer-to-peer conversation. It's like, hey, we speak to, I'll make it up, but look, we're speaking to marketing teams every day and they really don't understand who their audiences are, which means their budgets are under pressure, their teams are getting cut back, CFOs kind of fighting against them. Like, are these things keeping you awake at night? And if they're genuinely not, it's like, cool, crack on. I wish you all the best with your business. But, it's a peer-to-peer conversation. And if they have got a problem, it's like, well, look, if you've got that problem, we might be able to help. Why don't we, and I think once you realize that it is that level and it's a level conversation, you're not trying to, oh, Corey, can I have 5 minutes of your time, sir? Tipping your hat. I think it's a good thing. I think if you can learn that, I think it really helps shift that mindset because society has conditioned us that salespeople are annoying. And it's like, well, they're not. Good salespeople are professionals here to help people solve problems. They facilitate solutions for businesses, right? So,
Yeah, exactly. Well said. And you mentioned that you now don't have the sort of sales problems that you used to previously. So how important is it to have the right team?
massively. Yeah, and I would say even earlier than getting a team, I think go to market is probably now as if maybe more important than having a good product. If we look back to the heydays of kind of SaaS, 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't a crowded market, so people were able to build good stuff. And engineers without any sales skills were getting people to use and adopt their product. Even if I should look at the space I'm in, you look in SaaS and marketing, there's like thousands of tools now. It's like 12, 15,000, whatever. The number keeps growing. So if you've not thought about go to market, your product, it could be the best product in the world, but it's going to sink. So I think you've really got to think about that early, and I think if I was doing this journey again, I'd probably spend as much time trying to find, a strong GTM founder alongside me as a technical person, or try and kind of really play that out. There's loads of kind of go-to-market playbooks out there, right? And all the playbook stuff is great, but you really need to really think how it's going to work for your business and really plan that out. So yeah, and then fast forward, having a good team, same, so how do you have those people who thrive in a startup, right? Because startups are an interesting place. Again, uncertainty is high, so you need people who can deal with uncertainty, which I made the mistake of hiring people that couldn't, frankly, even though, it was quite obvious we were a startup and I thought everyone knew that startups were, uncertain places. So, my hiring process had to mature, but that comes with hiring a good team who can help you focus on go to market and, make sure that bit's solid. Because if you haven't got that team, if you can't trust them to get on and explore things, then, it's actually more work for you as a founder. So if you're just going to try and police them all the time.
I'm really interested by like building out teams and stuff. And what would you say is the most influential type of hire at sort of like different stages throughout the business?
Do you mean sort of influential, what, to the
Like
whole
most
team?
impactful. So it like has like getting the first salesperson after you're doing founder-led sales, did that make the biggest impact on your business? Or was it sort of a marketing person? Or you said you didn't have a go-to-market initially. Was go-to-market quite important?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there would probably there's a couple of answers. I think we brought on a junior data person into the team. Um, and that sort of freed up me and some of the early team a lot more. And she was just, she is, she's absolutely amazing. Very, very smart, gets on with stuff. And it really sort of helped us, take our hands off a bit, if you like. So I think just from an impactful point of view of seeing how good staff work, like I think that was really, really good. And then, yeah, I think it's then into the salespeople. were then after that for me, because fundamentally it just allowed us to scale the concurrency of conversations. Because again, the biggest bottleneck early stage is the volume of conversations. Again, there's so many kind of books recommend just, reaching out to people and asking for conversations. And don't get me wrong, I spent a lot of time doing that, but so many people do that now that I think there's a lot more hesitancy to do that from a lot of people. So it's harder to get conversations. So therefore you just need more people doing it. And, that's just about volume. You have to kiss a lot of frogs. So having someone else who was able to do that meant that, it was that nice feeling that, if I had to take a day off for whatever reason, things didn't stop. I knew conversations were still happening, and, connections were still going on. So yeah, that's the two lenses. One about the business, but also from a founder, that first when she came in, allowing us to know that it would work was just a great feeling as well.
Nice. And have you noticed the sort of pattern of A players breeding more A players, but if you have sort of B or C players, they kind of breed B or C players, and it can have a negative impact on the business?
Not directly,
Okay.
I think we're still relatively small, and we have got rid of people who haven't performed, if that makes sense. So maybe not as quickly as we should sometimes, but yeah, I've definitely had to exit people who haven't had the right fit for the business. Again, it's one of these cliches that gets rolled out, but like, culture is really important for us, because if I hire someone tomorrow, that person is effectively 10% of the culture of the business. Right? If I go and hire 3 or 4 people tomorrow, we could dilute the business culture in half, which could break it. And I think I think I'm being fair. I think if you asked anyone of the team, they'd all say we've got a good culture. They enjoy working with each other. Doesn't mean people don't have difficult conversations, but I think for that reason, I've sort of had to get rid of people at stages, because it hasn't just worked with the culture and worked with the team. But the question is something, I don't know if you ever read. What's the book? It's a great book for any founder. It's by Reed Hastings from Netflix. It's about Netflix's culture.
Oh,
Um,
I haven't read the book, but I've read the leaked sort of
okay,
doc of what they
I
expect
don't.
in their company and
Uh,
what they send to hires.
Here we go. I knew I had it nearby. No rules, rules.
Oh, awesome.
So it's by Reed Hastings and Erin Mayer, and it's really about how do you build high performing teams. Obviously, they were talking about it when they got to thousands of people, but it's a book that is constantly in the back of my head when we're hiring. And to your point, Byron, about A players and B players, to make sure that we don't settle, and we do. Now, the bit that people don't mention when they're talking about that is, when you're a startup, it can also be hard to recruit people, right? Because, actually, when you're at, Series A, let's call it that, whether you go down the series routes or not, you know, you're proven, you got loads of money, you can throw money at the problem, right? So you can actually attract people because you've got a bit of momentum. But in the early days, you've got to kind of sell people that dream as a founder that says, yeah, look, we might only be 6 people out of this small office with a handful of customers. So it's that balance too. But yeah, as we go, it's like, how do I make sure that we do bring on, this girl I mentioned before. I was joking with the team with one of the team the other day, and I said, if I could create a clone machine for her, then that would be ideal, because people like that are very special, and they just get stuff done.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think obviously, like you said, with Netflix being as big of a company as it is now, they're able to sort of pick and choose. But that document that was leaked was quite interesting because it was saying things like, we don't want these type of people. So like, don't apply if like you're not willing to work extra hours. If you and there was a whole long list that kind of freaked out a few people, but that was exactly its intention.
Yeah,
But I suppose, yeah, as a smaller business, you can't be as choosy or as upfront because then you don't get the pick of the good talent.
no, but there's a phrase, I can't remember who told it to me, but I sort of always try and remember it, that I'd rather have a hole in my business than an asshole, right? And like, even though we don't have to pick, I still only want to hire great people, and I'd rather, you know, I wouldn't have hired anyone into the business just for the sake of having someone there. It just means it takes longer to find them, but I'd rather have no one in that position, someone who's going to just disrupt what we're doing in a negative way, bring down the team, bring down the culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what's the long-term goal for Herdify?
Long-term goal. So as I said, we're a SaaS platform for audiences. Today, we're sort of focused in the UK. Really, for us, it's about how do we become a global platform for audience intelligence, which sounds horribly stuffy and corporate, but I fundamentally believe that with what's now available today with us with compute power and technology, we can build much more interesting ways to understand consumer behavior. Business is about understanding consumer behavior. So I think, there's so much of the world that doesn't think about it. We've got an opportunity to do that, not just on a kind of UK small platform scale, but to be global, but also to be plumbed into other people's solutions. So if anyone's building anything that needs to understand consumer behavior, they should be able to plug in, the Herdify API and get that insight. And that could be consumer brands, that could be governments, that could be health agencies. If we're trying to think about how do we solve some of our health crises, if we look in the UK, like obesity is, a problem, right? We still have issues with people smoking. These health benefits have huge impacts to the health service, which have knock-on effects to the taxpayer. That's not a problem that's easy to solve as a startup because making that commercially viable is hard, right? But as we scale, using the insights that we've got, using these models, is like, well, how do we help countries do that? Globally, there's so many things that we can build a successful commercial business that helps, corporate fee-paying businesses to help us grow and do the R&D, that we can then have a kind of civic business that can help with those sorts of issues that understanding human behavior would help globally, all as a kind of wrapped up platform, API type business that's globally available. Audacious
Awesome.
goal, but you got to have them, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that sounds really cool. And what's your biggest challenge at the moment?
Um, the biggest challenge is the irony of our own product. We joke, or you'll probably remember the phrase "nobody got fired for hiring IBM," right? And
Yeah.
that was true because IBM was often towards the end not the best decision, but if you did it, nobody in your own company thought you're an idiot, right? It's like, well, everyone uses IBM. So by Tom choosing IBM, he's just followed conventional wisdom, best practice, worst statement in business ever, that you haven't put yourself out there. But, if in that pitch process, you had IBM and, some unknown technology company, if you're the person that takes the decision on the unknown technology company and they fail, let's be clear, they get the same result that IBM, they both fail. The unknown technology company means you as the individual are hung out to dry. Like, why did you choose that company that nobody's ever heard of? Yada, yada, yada. You can see how that plays out. And that's herd mentality. It's right. It's why consumers don't buy new products. So we're kind of having that same thing within our own business. I always joke that if Microsoft had built what we built, everyone would be going, oh, wow, Microsoft can predict where people are like talking about products offline. That's crazy cool. But because an unknown technology company out of the UK have done it, people are like, is that legit? Yada, yada, yada. So that's the piece we're working through. That's our kind of biggest challenge. But that's what I love about behavioral science, because once you understand the challenge, the solution is often presented. The solution is about networks of people. How do you increase the number of times your brand is heard amongst a group of people? So typically a tech company would say, well, let's try and hit everybody. We're trying to do that sort of channel by channel. So, we started off in the mail sector 14 months ago. Nobody knew our name. Now we've got relationships with probably nearly most organizations in that sector, which is great because we started small. So it's like, how do we then replicate that in connected TV, out of home? How do we kind of build our own herd mentality within those pieces, which allows us to kind of get past that barrier? And like we talk to our customers about, you'll eventually hit that tipping point where, it will then become the norm that if you don't buy Herdify, then you're an idiot, at which point we can then start to scale outside the UK and repeat that playbook. Thankfully, by then, our own technology will tell us which regions to go to next, right? Because our whole thing is about how do you identify where your herds are forming, we'll use our own tech to build our own growth playbook. So, but that's a little bit to come. Yeah, we've got a few steps to get to before that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I've heard the same analogy, um, comparing the like big four consulting firms and how you can't get fired if you
Mhm.
choose to work with one of the big four consulting firms, but as soon as you choose something outside of that, then
Yeah,
yeah, you're next on the line. It's
yeah.
so interesting.
Well, it is, and if you think about how the corporate world is built, the corporate world does not reward risk taking.
Yeah,
The corporate world builds safety. So therefore, it's all about having, and this is something I think Rory Sutherland says a lot. It's not about the best decision; it's about the decision you can defend, right?
yeah,
And if as long as you can defend the decision, and by defending it, that by definition means 100 other people have had to go first. You can point to them, then you're seen as a rational human being, right? But actually, even if you think this could be the solution, if you're the first person to do it, that's an irrational decision. Irrationality is not rewarded in the corporate world. So therefore, we don't do it. Everyone wants to keep their job. We've got their mortgages to pay. Absolutely get it. But we sort of haven't done it. And we haven't structured companies that way. And it's one of those things that, I like to think about sometimes that, when we are a company of, 10, 20, 30,000 people, how do we incentivize that thinking in the company that, actually you do get fired for hiring IBM, if they're the wrong company, right? It's not that they're always the wrong company, but it shouldn't just be hiring the best or the biggest, or so the best reputation or the biggest is the right decision. How do you incentivize people to genuinely take a punt on something and say, again, in a way that isn't just so like, oh, I won't put any thought into it, so you got to balance it, but that's an interesting thought experiment to have.
yeah, it is. And my final question is: if you had to give an aspiring entrepreneur one piece of advice, what would it be?
Yes. I think the thing for me would be probably this theme I've already talked about is about staying curious, and I'll maybe make it a bit more factual than that, is just asking questions. Um and by that, like if you've got an idea, seek out people that disagree with you. Humans, we have something called confirmation bias. In research, if you're scanning an article, you'll find the bit of information that says your idea is right. You'll talk to people and people will go, great idea. Back to my restaurant idea. There were loads of people that said, great idea. I didn't ask anyone why it wouldn't work. I
Hmm.
didn't ask for the problems. And, there's two things there for me, because I think if you're open to hearing the downsides, there's, you do two things with that information. You either hear about it and get really defensive, right? And go, no, no, but, or you go, it's a good idea. I'm going to go and try and answer that question, right? And if someone says it might not work for this reason, or what about this, not knowing is a good thing, because it allows you to really go and explore it. And that really comes back to asking questions, being open to, asking questions that try and identify failure, and being open to hearing answers you don't want. And I think if you can do that, you'll get a lot more of the research done early on, because I always do it. I get asked a lot about, um, you know, ideas, and people sort of tell me what they're thinking. And I'll, not to be a dick, I'll always try and offer them, like, have you thought about this? Almost as a game choice for you to see how they react. And I see some people get really defensive because in their head, it's like, this is the best idea ever. Others are like, yeah, it's an interesting angle. Let me think on that. All right. And haven't tracked enough of them to see what happens. But I like to think the people that take that on board and think about it are probably the people that are gonna do more with it, because they're not invested in the idea for the idea's sake. They're really trying to work out whether it's a problem that needs solving or they can actually solve.
That's great advice. And before I end every conversation, I ask my guests if they have a question for me.
Yeah, I was really interested because you obviously have these conversations a lot.
Yes.
Like, what's the trait or the trend that kind of comes out from you the most from all these sort of interviews that you've done to the people that get into this line of work?
So there's a few common traits. One is like one that you just mentioned, that um your ego isn't attached to the solution or the problem you're trying to solve. A lot of these people are open for you to poke holes in everything and anything because they're on the mission to provide a solution. So if you can poke holes, they're like, great, thank you, because now that's sort of deviated my path a bit, and now I'm actually going in a better direction than the previous one. And another one is action takers. Um, some weren't necessarily action takers to start, but they started with smaller steps and sort of flexed that muscle till taking action became like a prerequisite and they were used to it. Um, that's one big thing that I've learned because I've always overthought things. And starting this podcast is one of those. And so that's a huge lesson for me is like, even if it's not polished already, if you take a step, momentum kind of takes over. Um, so I'd say those are the two big ones. Like their ego is detached and they're willing to take action. Are very common traits between people who are running their own businesses.
Yeah, I love that. And back to the question you asked earlier about can anybody do it? I think that's a good summary, right? Because if you read a lot of stuff about entrepreneurship, it's, or you saw the shows and the videos, it's all that loud, gregarious person, but you don't have to be loud or, super confident to detach your ego. And you don't have to be that to sort of take action. That's what I love. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great observation. So
And
yeah.
and they do things that are uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And it's realizing that like there's progress in the discomfort. Because a lot of people shy away from the uncomfortable. And yeah, people, and when you realize that like you're shying away from that for a reason, and that's
Yeah.
probably the direction you should be heading in. And
Yeah.
when you see progress by taking that action, you're more motivated to take that action. You kind of lean into the discomfort a bit more. That's also something I've noticed.
Yeah. Nice. Very cool.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Tom. I really enjoyed it. If listeners want to learn more about you or Herdify, where can they do so?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. It's a good place to check me out. So Tom Ridges, Ridges. I've got a cow next to my name for herd mentality, so you can't miss me. So do that. And then you can check us out on our website, herdify.com. And we've got various sort of newsletters you can subscribe to if you're interested. The final one, for those who are interested in behavioral science, you'll probably know Rory Sutherland. He has a online video course, Rory's Mad Masters. And within that, he has a module on herd mentality. And once a semester, me and Rory have a sort of, fireside chat talking all things herd mentality. So if you really want to accelerate your behavioral science journey and see me there, you can sign up to that. And you can check out me and Rory talking as well. So yeah, the best places.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, speak soon.
Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. One more quick reminder before you go. I have a weekly newsletter by the same name, Another Excuse, where I cover 4 topics: something that has changed my perception, a tool that could be useful to you, content that is actually worth consuming, and a concept that I try break down and explain. If this sounds of any interest to you and you need a kick up the arse, then you can subscribe at the link below. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next week.